Hello everybody, Thomas here, and welcome back to SFF180 and this ridiculously late episode of BookTube SFF Babbles, where I will be discussing overlooked science fiction. Now, considering that science fiction is less read generally, especially on BookTube, compared to fantasy, it occurs to me that I could probably mention just about anything and have it be an example of overlooked SF. I could talk about the Foundation trilogy, and it would be overlooked SF to a lot of people. But what I'm going to do, just as I did in my overlooked fantasy episode, is concentrate on some recent releases that I think fairly represent the state of the art, and which you would do well to discover and add to your TBR. Now, I think it's kind of a sad fact that science fiction is assumed, probably by a lot of people who don't read very much of it, to be chock full of dry and uninteresting tales with all kinds of nuts and bolts shop talk for engineering nerds. Either that, or it is assumed to be just weaker at things that fantasy is assumed to be stronger at, like character development and world building. Now, as I'm about to demonstrate to you where the very best science fiction is concerned, this is exactly the opposite of true. And the fact that a lot of the books I'm going to be talking about were released into an indifferent marketplace in which urban fantasies that were virtually indistinguishable from one another were simply flying off the shelves means that a great many readers missed out on stories that were absolute explosions of imagination, where all bets are off and creativity simply knew no bounds. So if you're a reader who thinks that there is nothing new under the sun, well then sit back while I introduce you to two novels and two series that are going to take you to worlds you never knew you wanted to visit. If you think you've seen world building, well, hold on to your junk. In the 5-volume series Verga, Karl Schroeder transports us to one of science fiction's most remarkable habitats since Larry Niven created the Ring World. VIRGA is an enormous bubble in space, full of sky, 5,000 miles across, with an outer shell composed of fullerene nanomaterials, inside of which people live among spinning towns and cities and airborne habitats, while exotic feathered fish fly through the air. Now, at the core of VIRGA is an enormous artificial sun called Candace, while out at the rim, in the darkness, along the outer edge, massive floating icebergs may contain secret pirate hordes. There are even airborne forests and oceans. Now, the stories are essentially high seas adventure in the classic mold, except, of course, in the skies. Now, in Book 1, Son of Suns, Hayden, a callow youth from the nation of Erie, whose parents were murdered during an invasion by the rogue nation of Slipstream, seeks revenge against Slipstream's naval commander, Admiral Fanning. But Hayden's plans become complicated when he comes to the attention of Admiral Fanning's even more cunning wife, Venera. Now, eventually, the story leads to a race to acquire the key to Candace, to control the very power of Verga's sun. Schroeder then goes on in his sequels to expand upon his creation, his world, his stories, his characters, by changing things up so that he's not repeating himself. For instance, Venera, who is a villain in Book 1, Son of Suns, becomes the protagonist and the hero of Book 2, Queen of Candace. So, while the plots may be a bit traditional, when set against this backdrop, there is nothing in the Verga series that isn't simply dazzling. Gareth Powell's CAC Macaque has a lot more going on for it than just a title whose sheer silliness commands your attention. Now, 3 years ago, this book tied for the BSFA Award for Best Novel with Ancillary Justice, and that is no fluke. It is a rousing, funny, uncouth, fairly unpredictable adventure set in an alternate near future where, in the 20th century, about halfway through 1950-ish or so, England and France merged to form a single nation. The titular ape is a cigar-chomping fighter pilot who is the main character in a hugely popular online MMO set during the Second World War. I have also unilaterally decided that he talks like Bob Hoskins. Now, CAC is getting the idea that something is definitely off about his life, Not the least of which is he seems to be completely incapable of dying, and in order to test this little theory out, he starts putting himself into increasingly insane suicidal situations. Meanwhile, out in meat space, our protagonist is 19-year-old Prince Marovec, the son of Alyssa Celestine, the wife of England's king, who was himself a few years back nearly killed by terrorists and is still mostly out of commission. Now, Alyssa is also the owner of Celestine Tech, the company that owns and runs Acac's game. Now, Marovec has very little interest in poncy courtly life, and so he is off dating Julie, this purple-haired working-class girl from Paris. Because why wouldn't you? Now, Julie happens to belong to the usual club of idealistic youth activists who believe that AIs deserve legal recognition as autonomous entities. And so, because love makes you stupid, Marovec helps Julie and her pals infiltrate his mother's business headquarters in the interest of liberating CAC Macaque. But what they actually discover turns out to be a bigger surprise than they were expecting. Now, mixing action and suspense and obnoxious humor, and yes, even a little bit of warmth, all in equal measure, CAC Macaque was a book I described at the time as being the most gleefully irresponsible fun you could hope to have with a monkey without having to explain yourself to the police. Now, Powell eventually produced sequels, rounding out a truly bananas trilogy. Yes, I just made a bananas joke. I'm very sorry. Now, if you have been paying attention to my reviews for any length of time, you have doubtless heard me over and over singing the praises of Kenyon, one of science fiction's great underappreciated visionaries. Rest assured, I have no plans to shut up about it until you guys come to your senses and start reading this woman. Now, after half a dozen standalone science fiction novels, Kenyon took her first step into series fiction with a 4-volume epic titled The Entire and the Rose. Now, The Entire is an artificial pocket universe created by the Tarig, a curious race who have peopled their creation with engineered duplicates of species found in natural universes like our own, which they call the Rose. Now, The Entire defies easy description. It's like a sprawling landscape that covers galactic distances. And it's in kind of a radial shape, like a radial galaxy, bordered on its sides by these sheer walls of exotic matter, and up above by a sky that never darkens. Now, travel across the Entire's vast distances is done on vessels piloted by beings called Navatars, upon a river called the Nai, which is itself composed of exotic matter. But all of this is very, very tightly controlled by the despotic rule of the Tarig. Now, our series protagonist is Quinn, a spacefaring Earthman who once, on a voyage, accidentally broke through the brains, separating the Entire from the Rose, and eventually losing his family there. Now, Quinn as a character admittedly is not quite as interesting as his daughter, who is really, really cool. But anyway, sent back to the Entire one more time, he intends not only to find them, but to stop the Entire from drawing energy from our universe in order to sustain itself, something that it is currently doing at a pace that threatens to make the entire shebang do a big crunch. From here, we are introduced to a mind-boggling array of alien characters and cultures, exotic, baroque, altogether astounding, and all of it set against a saga that is told on a scale to rival that of the Dune novels. Now, what Kenyon is doing here conceptually is, of course, not altogether different from what you see in Portal fantasies, right? Where a hero from our world steps into the wardrobe and crosses over into the secondary world full of magic and wonder, right? But by recontextualizing all of that in a science fictional setting, employing concepts derived from the most mind-bending frontiers of cosmological science, what Kenyon has delivered is an eye-popping epic that leaves most of the rest of contemporary science fiction and fantasy choking on its stardust. Finally, we turn to Alastair Reynolds, a major figure in the new space opera movement, but a guy who is not appreciated as much as I think he should be when it comes time every year for science fiction to start doling out its awards. And that's a real mistake because, especially in the case of Blue Remembered Earth, which is the first volume in his trilogy Poseidon's Children, which is now complete, he has produced a book that I think is every bit as Hugo and Nebula-worthy as anything I have seen on those awards ballots in the last several years. And it's a particularly notable work coming at a time when a great many readers of SF have been complaining that there are too few optimistic visions of the future in the genre. Now, Reynolds' book depicts an imperfect but still forward-looking world set in the 22nd century, a time when the Earth is recovering from the most devastating effects of climate change, and Africa has emerged as the global economic superpower, led most prominently by the Kenyon Corporation, a family enterprise whose members are not exactly close. But when Eunice, the Kenyon matriarch, finally dies, black sheep of the family Jeffrey is drawn back into the business, when it is learned that Eunice was hiding something in a safe deposit box on the moon. Now this, in turn, opens up even more cryptic clues, leading to what becomes kind of a scavenger hunt for more and more secrets spread out on Mars and on Phobos and way out deep in trans-Neptunian space. Eunice was up to something, but what exactly? And what does it mean, not only for the future of the family and the business, but the world? The shift away from a Eurocentric perspective makes the book a rather exhilarating entry in the emerging genre of Afrofuturism. Now the cast is, I believe, if memory serves, without a single Caucasian character. But if you're going to be silly and think that that's all political correctness at work, no. It is speculative fiction. It is envisioning what the future would look like, the social and political and economic ramifications of a world in which the traditional, long-standing Western superpowers have collapsed. Blue Remembered Earth is a very dense saga that demands attentive reading, but it is also one that respects the hard SF foundations laid by the generation of Arthur C. Clarke while forging ahead on its own path. And it brings to science fiction the kind of story the genre sees, I think, way too rarely these days. The kind of story where people can actually look up at the stars and dream. And that is it for this BookTube SFF Babbles, everybody. 2 novels, 2 series that you guys probably overlooked, but ones that I think will really very much enhance your reading experience. As usual, Amazon links for everything I've talked about in this episode are going to be in the description. And otherwise, remember, if you enjoyed watching, please hit that like button, share the video far and wide with your SFF reading friends, and above all, if you have not already done so, please subscribe. That is how SFF180 grows as a channel. And until I see you guys next time, happy reading.